In this example, we have a chemist reacting 15.0 grams of calcium with 15.0 grams of oxygen to make 21.0 grams of lime and some leftover oxygen. And the question is, if he wants to make 55 grams of lime with no leftovers, how much of each element should he use? To answer this question, we first need to figure out the recipe for making lime with no leftovers. The law of mass conservation will help us here. After all, we know the chemist started with 30.0 grams of stuff, 15.0 grams of calcium, and 15.0 grams of oxygen. The law of mass conservation tells us at the end there has to be 30.0 grams of stuff. Well, there were 21.0 grams of lime, so the rest of the mass has to be in the leftover oxygen. So the mass of the leftover oxygen then is 30.0 grams minus the 21.0 grams that come from the lime. That means the mass of leftover oxygen is 9.0 grams. Well, if there were 9.0 grams of oxygen left over, that means only 6.0 grams of oxygen were actually used. After all, the chemist started with 15.0 grams, ended up having 9.0 grams left over, so only 6.0 grams were actually used in the reaction. This tells us that the real recipe for making lime is 15.0 grams of calcium plus 6.0 grams of oxygen makes 21.0 grams of lime with no leftovers. That's a great recipe for making lime, but it does not produce the mass of lime that the chemist wants. The chemist wants 55 grams of lime. So what we're going to have to do is increase the proportions of the recipe so that we make more lime. How are we going to figure that out? Well, if I want to make 55 grams of lime, and I know how to make 21.0 grams of lime, all I have to do is figure out what number, when multiplied by 21.0 grams, will make 55 grams. Mathematically, I would say 21.0 grams times x equals 55 grams. And I need to figure out x. Well, I can figure out x using algebra. X is just 55 grams divided by 21.0 grams. That's 2.6. Notice there are no units attached to this because the units of gram canceled. This is called a dimensionless quantity. Well, now we know the factor by which we need to increase the proportions of the recipe. So I just take my original recipe and multiply by 2.6. The mass of the calcium in the recipe is 15.0 grams. Multiply that by 2.6 and we get 39 grams. The mass of oxygen in the recipe is 6.0 grams. Multiply that by 2.6 and we're left with 16 grams. So the recipe for making 55 grams of lime with no leftovers is to take 39 grams of calcium and react it with 16 grams of oxygen.